Welcome to Funding the Yes, a podcast series organized by the California Criminal Justice Funders Group. My name is Adrienne Sky Roberts, and I am the coordinator of CCJFG. We are a funder affinity group that supports California funders to be in solidarity with and accountable to the movements to end prisons, policing, and criminalization. Funding the Yes is a three-part series that asks the question, what does funding the yes look like within intersectional aspects of social and racial justice movements? Through conversations amongst funders, we focus on strategies to fund building a more just future for our communities and ending systems of injustice. Each episode is co-created by funder members of CCJFG. Our first episode focuses on healing justice and features a conversation between Gina Peralta, Program Officer in the Human Rights Program of the Heising-Simons Foundation, and Melanie Havelin, Executive Director of the John M. Lloyd Foundation. And now I'll turn it over to Gina.
Hi, Melanie. How's it going today?
Hi, Gina. I am really excited to be talking healing justice with you today. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm really good. I'm also just so excited to be in conversation with you. You know, we've talked about having this conversation for quite some time. And so to do this with you on the podcast is incredible. Mm-hmm. This conversation, you know, about healing and the intersection of healing and movement building is so important. And it's also important to have this conversation and speak about why and how the philanthropic sector should fund healing.
Yeah.
Your name specifically has come up in such a positive way when we talk about healing justice with our grantees. And so I'm just really excited to get into it with you.
Thank you so much for those kind words. I've really been looking forward to this conversation too. And I think it would be great for us to start out with you telling us a little bit about what is healing justice, so we're all on the same page.
Absolutely. I think that it's important to start off by saying that the term healing justice was first coined by Kara Page in the early 2000s, probably about 2007. So healing justice is both a framework and a practice, and it works to address the impacts of both intergenerational and chronic trauma on historically marginalized communities. And then we're talking about, you know, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, LGBTQ, immigrants. And healing justice recognizes the impacts of slavery, genocide, lynching, and other forms of state-sanctioned violence on marginalized communities. The framework, it also recognizes that these very communities continue to be traumatized by mass criminalization and mass incarceration, including immigrant detention.
And the level of trauma has escalated dramatically over the past year and a half as we've experienced these society-wide concurrent crises. BIPOC communities have been hit hardest by COVID-19. Black and brown people have lost jobs, housing, and in many cases, their lives to the virus. And to make matters worse, they've watched in horror as Black people were violently murdered by law enforcement.
Exactly. BIPOC folks are really hurting right now, Melanie. And I know you know this. And it's nearly impossible for them to take time to process, rest, or rejuvenate because of the constant threats to their very existence by way of state-sanctioned murder, mass incarceration, deportation, and voter disenfranchisement.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the perpetual fight for their lives leads to physical, mental health issues, burnout among organizers, and inter-organizational tensions, which are a major threat to the sustainability of the movement. And this is why healing plays such a critical role in grassroots organizing and power building. Let's listen to Kara Page describe the history of this intersection in a recent interview with Francisca Porchas in an episode of La Cura podcast. It's really great.
Cool.
And at the height of fascism in the early 2000s, looking very much like now in 2021, we were at our wits' end, and I saw pain and grief. And I thought, well, what were they doing in the civil rights movement? And started to ask elders in the South in different movements, from AIM to the Young Lords, Black Panther Party. How did you hold grief and trauma during the 60s and 70s? And started to ask healers, how are you holding grief and trauma for movements? All movements, right? Labor, migrant justice, racial justice, reproductive justice. How is it showing up? How does it manifest? And wouldn't you like to be at the table of strategy? Why do healers get separated outside of strategy and liberation ideas? Why are we not at the center of movement tables, or centering healing as an integral strategy to political liberation at movement tables? And people said, well, yeah, I'm about that. Energy healers, earth-based, body-based healers being asked that question, who I knew were already politically oriented because they were doing work as an extension of their social justice work.
Healing justice creates the space for both community members and organizers to process loss and trauma. It also creates the opportunity to transform pain into collective power that really does lead to long-term and sustainable changes in material conditions.
Oh, so true. I mean, that's the real power of healing justice. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about healing justice practices.
Yes. Before I get into the actual practice, I want to just give a little bit of history.
Mm-hmm.
So while the term healing justice was coined in 2007, some of these practices have been used by communities of color for generations. I think it's important to note that European colonizers didn't allow Black and Indigenous people to practice or even learn their traditional ways of healing. You know, these practices really empowered folks and using these practices, and that was forbidden. Fortunately, these ways have been passed down. They've been reclaimed and integrated into organizing strategies that lead to significant policy changes. The practices can vary by individual, organization, even coalition, and include everything from care stipends or healing circles for staff within an organization to offering post-jail visit healing spaces for community members.
Wow.
Yes, it's absolutely incredible, Melanie.
Mm-hmm.
These healing spaces, they offer support to family members after a very emotional jail visit with a loved one.
Mm-hmm.
They also create an opportunity to inform the development of campaigns that have the potential to lead to substantive changes for folks in the community who've been impacted by these systems. Again, this is exactly why it's so important that funders support this work, but it's also important that funders do so in a respectful way.
And it's also important for us to not be limited on what are practices for healing justice. Like, it's almost an endless variety. And that practices that work really well for one person and one community might not have power for another one.
Yes. You know, I'm really curious to hear about your journey and the journey of John M. Lloyd Foundation. And as I mentioned earlier, your work is so inspiring and just have heard so many great things from grantees. And so I wonder if you could just share about what inspired the Lloyd Foundation to begin supporting healing justice.
I'm happy to share it. It's really a great organization to work for. It's a family foundation. And as the younger generation of the family took the reins of the foundation, their interests were guided by the fact that each one of them is a social worker or a therapist by trade. So their approach to everything is always trauma-informed. And then as we develop relationships, as we entered this field in 2014, we had relationships with leaders like Patrice Cullors and Mark Anthony Clayton Johnson, who we're happily to have on our board right now. We deepened our understanding that the trauma experienced by system-impacted people wasn't just due to, isolated incidents within the system, but also generational trauma caused by systemic oppression and white supremacy delusion that all led them into the system.
Yes.
As a small foundation, we've always been striving to have the greatest impact with limited funding. And becoming more aware of this crisis of trauma helped us to see the need to dedicate resources specifically for healing justice. So in addition to our general support grants, for the last several years, the Lloyd Foundation has been offering each of our grantees an additional $5,000 grant that they get to use however they want to promote healing justice for their staff and their membership.
That's really, really incredible. I'm curious, why did the foundation decide to offer separate healing justice grants versus just the general ops grant?
This is a really good question. And there's a couple of good reasons for funders to consider doing a separate grant, even if you're giving general support, which hopefully everybody is, because we should be. It's hard to underestimate the value in sending the message really clearly to grantees that we as funders care about their health and well-being and not just deliverables. We've, funders, our whole community has been responsible for creating a lot of pressure on our grantees to meet benchmarks and objectives, and to such a point that many would not feel emboldened to use a general support grant for staff and organizational wellness. They just wouldn't think that that would be okay with funders, and they'd be risking ongoing funding. So it's important for us to overtly communicate that we see the success of the movement dependent on the wellness of those leading it. And I want to acknowledge here that Kara Page's healing justice definition is very clearly about structural change, not personal wellness. But the Lloyd Foundation believes that personal wellness needs must be met in order to have the capacity to work for structural change. And I just really have to stress, if you are considering healing justice grants, that there can't be preconceived ideas about what is appropriate to do with healing justice grants. There aren't wrong answers, and the grantees themselves are the ones who will know best what they need. So allow them to make the decisions.
Can you talk a little bit about how grantees have responded to receiving this kind of funding?
Sure. Overall, it's been overwhelmingly positive. There have been some who've been unsure about what to do with the funds, that they have less of a well-developed healing justice practice. We are in the process right now of compiling a list of resources and healers that are available. But it's also crucial for us to not direct how the funds are used. Like I said, I just can't emphasize that enough. Some of our grantees have needed to be convinced that they really can use their funds for personal wellness. We have a grantee who's immunocompromised, and when the wildfires were raging through Northern California, she needed to rent a place far from Oakland in order to be in clean air, that she could just live. And we had to convince her that it was totally appropriate for her to use those healing justice grant funds for that rent, because there's a lot of distrust about, funder intention, even if we say, oh yeah, it's general support. Yes, you get to make the decisions. So you just can't emphasize that enough. And many of our grantees have remarked how much it means to know that we care about them, that we actually care about their personal wealth, that that's a priority of ours. And that we're not just looking at whether or not they meet their advocacy objectives. One of our grantees, Tina Vargas, co-founder of Initiate Justice, she told me that when they received the grant, which was in the very early days, the start of Initiate Justice, it showed her that Initiate Justice needed to really invest in the wellness of their staff and organizers. So now they dedicate far more than JMLF's grant to wellness stipends for everybody in their organization. And they've seen amazing results.
Wow, Melanie, there's so many learnings here for new funders who are interested in supporting healing justice. So I'm wondering, could you provide some direction for program staff who are interested in supporting healing justice? And how could they bring this topic to their boards?
Yeah. This is our challenge always as program staff, I guess. I think the best argument in favor of healing justice investment is that we cannot ultimately be successful in transforming this devastatingly harmful criminal justice system if those in the movement are reeling from trauma. If it seems appropriate, it could be useful to do an exercise to get board members to understand this on a real personal, physical, spiritual level. You could ask them to recall how they felt physically within their bodies, as well as emotionally, at their most scared, their most exhausted, most vulnerable point. To sit for a moment and really feel those feelings in their body again, and then ask them, how effective and efficient were they at those points? How focused could they be in those moments? And ask them to remember how they felt at their strongest, most contented moments. Which state would make them more likely to succeed? I mean, it just becomes so obvious. And, I give that as an option. I recognize that approach may take some courage in breaking with institutional norms, or we might not talk to our board about feelings. I mean, I'm lucky I work for therapists. They talk about feelings, but that's what's needed if we truly want to transform.
Yes. So what if this approach isn't feasible and, we don't have a board or, funders don't have boards that are more driven by feelings? What would be your recommendation?
Which is probably like almost everybody in philanthropy. So if you have a more typical board that responds better to a more cerebral approach, you might present them with the plethora of research on the long-term benefits of wellness modalities. Overall, I think the biggest thing is for you to get your board to understand 3 key points. And the first one, this is just so critical to our work. The very best way to transform the system is with advocacy led by those most impacted. If we're not doing that, we're so not going to be successful. We're really missing it. The second point is those who are most impacted have experienced trauma from the system and trauma, historical, systemic, individual, that led them into the system in the first place. So they're the ones to lead it, and they're traumatized. So the third point is people are more effective at whatever they're doing when they're not reacting to trauma. So doing what we can to address that trauma to help them develop healing modalities is really critical to success.
How can philanthropy align its internal healing justice practices with those of the movement?
That is the toughest question. That's really a huge challenge. I would say one possibility is, as with any other issue, first we have to acknowledge that there's a problem. Philanthropy needs to change its perspective as being outside the movement, outside community. We are part of the community. We're human beings. We live in the community. In order to do so, it's important to acknowledge that systemic oppression and white supremacy delusion are traumatic for all of us, regardless of where we fall in the power hierarchy, regardless of wealth or class, regardless of race. How this oppression impacts us is dependent on those aspects of our identity, but we are all impacted. And so once we realize there's a problem and we acknowledge its impact on us, we need to start the long process of examining how our privileges and our trauma, direct and vicarious, working with traumatized populations, manifest within ourselves personally, within our funding organizations, and in our relationships with grantees. The second option is it's important to examine how we treat staff within our organizations. So looking at what kind of health and wellness benefits are offered. Does the culture within our organization promote wellness? We should also reflect on how our internal salary and benefits compare to what our grantees have. And what can we do to close that gap? We should also examine how much power and influence system-impacted people of color, and other marginalized communities have within our organizations and our decision-making processes. And how can we increase their share of that real power?
Wow. So powerful. So apart from the board, how do we as staff members approach this work?
In my experience, it's challenging for white folks like me to wrap our heads around the scope of impact that systemic oppression and white supremacy delusion have had, and that are at the core of the trauma which needs healing. I think each of us needs to chart our own course over those tumultuous waters, personally and within our organizations. To me, a real key has been, especially for white philanthropoids, people who are employed by philanthropy, it's for us to do as much as possible to educate ourselves in every way possible. I know the California Criminal Justice Funders Group will be aggregating a list of existing resources, and that should be really helpful as well.
Yes, it will be. It will be very helpful to share those resources with our colleagues in philanthropy.
Gina, what have you found to be the greatest challenges to funding healing justice in your work at Heising-Simons?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, to be honest with you, when I first entered philanthropy just a couple years ago, I was really surprised that philanthropy was even interested in supporting healing justice. And I felt a lot of unease. I came into this work as someone who had engaged in my own healing practices that were practices that I learned from elders who hold these teachings as sacred. And so I was really afraid of what would become of these practices, if they became, a quote unquote funding priority with all of these deliverables. And so it was really scary. It's been really important for me as someone who is supporting this work to really ensure that if we're going to be supporting healing justice work and we're going to be funding this, that we hold this work with the care and reverence that my elders would. So that's something that I'm living into right now in this moment. And so that's been, it was a challenge when I first started in philanthropy. I think now a challenge that I see that folks are facing who are interested in funding healing justice is making sure that our boards understand what healing justice is and making that connection to organizing. Healing practices, especially those that have cultural roots, can be difficult to understand, especially if board members or philanthropic leaders, if this is not part of their worldview. It's really hard to understand, like, what is body work or what are energy workers, or I imagine that it's very difficult. So that's something that is a challenge. If we as philanthropoids truly believe that people closest to the problems in the community are closest to the solutions, then we really have to trust their leadership and expertise, even if we don't fully understand. And I think that that's a challenge.
Amen. I mean, I feel like we've been talking about this throughout our conversation, but it's just so important to keep hammering home that the need for us to be flexible is just critically important in this work. We can't be defining what healing justice is.
Absolutely. And to that point, Melanie, so often philanthropy tries to organize movement work into these nice, clean, neat boxes. But you and I know that this work doesn't play out like that on the ground. For example, healing justice is often considered direct service work by some funders, and then under prioritized and not funded because it's under the box of direct service. These funders who are putting healing justice into these boxes really fail to understand that direct service is healing work. And it's not only directly informing organizing strategies, but it also strengthens and sustains social justice movements. This is so important for funders to understand, and it really speaks to your point around flexibility.
Yeah. As more and more funders invest in healing justice, we also need to help broaden the community of healers and healing resources that can help system-impacted people leading the movement to transform the system from one that harms to one that heals. So I think it would be really worthwhile for funders to pool our resources to support a network of healers for the movement.
Absolutely. Underscore everything you just said. That is such an important point. This last year has really proved this to be true. In speaking to so many movement and thought leaders, it's apparent that there is a need for a bench of politicized healers and practitioners to respond to movement needs. The few movement healers that our folks trust and want to work with, they're at capacity. They cannot possibly meet the high demands that they're seeing in the field right now. So it might be something that, funders consider to possibly develop a pooled fund, maybe to support existing and emerging healers. I will say that because we are led by the movement, whatever development or whatever this looks like, it should be informed and led by our movement leaders.
Hear, hear. Oh my gosh, it's been such a delight to talk with you, Gina, and I am looking forward to continue collaborating with you on increasing access to healing justice for the movement.